Welcome, my friends, to ancient Mesopotamia, land of wonders, culture, art, cradle of civilization, and most importantly for this video, music. My name is Bilbamesh, lesser known younger brother of Gilgamesh. Much lesser known younger brother of Gilgamesh. Nobody knows that I exist, or my name. Peter Pringle never made a song about me, you know. So, I mean, I get it, you know. I just have a PhD from the Faculty of Musicology from the University of Akkad, you know. It's like, who cares, you know? I didn't fight beasts. I didn't cry for my boyfriend Enkidu, you know, who went to the underworld. I don't surpass all other kings. This is not me being jealous, by the way. It's not me being jealous. It's not. Stop! Now, before we begin the video proper, if you're asking yourself why all the talking, where's the music, I clicked here for the music. Well, there's the links in the description and in the pinned comment, so if you just want to hear a bunch of sounds and then move on with your life, you can just click on those and go on with your life. Are they gone? Okay, good. The TikTok mouth breathers are gone. Unfortunately, it's a very frequent comment that I get on my videos. People saying, I just hear you talking, I don't hear any music. Where's the music? I think that's due to the proliferation of YouTube Shorts and TikTok that have their place, obviously, but a lot of them, unfortunately, are content like this.
What did Sumerian music sound like?
And I'm not saying that this kind of content is literally worse than the Chernobyl disaster. I'm not at all implying this in any way whatsoever. I'm not at all implying that I would rather have the Chernobyl disaster happen everywhere around the world again, rather than watch one of these things. No, why would I imply that? Because the thing is, people who click on a video about a historical form of music, and then they ask, where's the music, where's the music? How to put it politely, the Mesopotamian gods went into the settings of their brain, and they lowered the brightness a little bit, I think. Not just a little bit, actually, a lot. Because, yeah, it's about historical music. And a lot of historical music is not entirely recoverable. We have lost a lot of it. And the problem with performances, as Alexander Lingus said, the head of Capella Romana, they specialize in early Christian chants and Byzantine chants. He said that performances are somewhat problematic in a certain way because with a performance, you have to choose. You have to decide how to do something. If you're doing a performance, you're gonna, you want to do vocal ornamentation here, well, you've just done it. You've done that, There's no abstraction with performances the way you can have with human language. With human language, you can say, well, they may have had this, they may have not have had this, they may have had this, but only for these few centuries in this region, right? And so human language is actually better suited for tackling and describing ancient forms of historical music, and this could not be more true than for the oldest form of music known to humankind that is written down, which is Mesopotamian music. Now, before we talk about what Mesopotamian music did sound like, it's very important to talk about what it did not sound like. This is an exercise that we have to do at the beginning of every one of these videos because the truth is that all of us, our understanding of historical music rests chiefly on pop culture and secondly on fact. If you've clicked on this video, then by all probability, you know the work of the man, the god, Peter Pringle. I am, he's my idol. I love his work so much. Like everything I do on this channel, okay? Straight up, everything I do on this channel is me pathetically trying to imitate 1,000th of the talent that this man has. This man is amazing. He's an extremely talented vocalist, especially when you hear his renditions of more Eastern music, like the Mesopotamian stuff. He manages to pull off these florid Eastern melismas incredibly well. But he's better than I am. I am actually Middle Eastern, and I cannot do those melismas anywhere near as well as he can do them. However, with all of that said, it's very important to specify that Peter Pringle's music is not reconstructed Mesopotamian music, nor is it meant to be. And I have to stress this, nor is it meant to be. Every time I do this, I did this last time with the Vikings or the Norse, where I talked about how Warjuna and Heilung are not historical reconstructed music, nor are they meant to be, which is something that Einar Selvik himself is the first to say, that Heilung themselves are the first to say. There were many people who thought that I was being mean to them, that I was trying to discredit them. I cannot discredit something they've never claimed to do in the first place. So if you read Peter Pringle's descriptions of his videos, and unfortunately people do not read descriptions, he specifies himself that he's using a mixture of historical elements with, imagination, period instruments, but Peter Pringle's music must be approached through the lens of historically themed music, not actually historical music. For example, we were talking about the highly florid Eastern style of singing. We don't know that they had that back then, right? A lot of people are just ready to assume that they did because, well, that's how Middle Easterners sing today. We don't know that this is how they sang all those years ago. There is absolutely no evidence either for or against, and I would say that actually the evidence leans slightly towards against, but we're going to come back to that. It is fundamentally mostly modern Middle Eastern music that is used in conjunction with certain period elements to produce an allegorical musical vision or image of Mesopotamia. Now, the reason, of course, I mentioned Peter Pringle is because really in pop culture and on the internet at least, his presence has really sort of he is the go-to. If you type ancient Mesopotamian music, that's the first thing that's going to come up. So I had to address this, but nothing but respect for the man. I will say that, however, the linguistic treatment is very good. From what I understand, from what people have told me, his linguistic pronunciation, he does render the language very well. You do get to hear the language. From what I've read, before 3000 BC, it's a little unsure what everything is about, but starting from after 3000 BC and really into 2000s BC, the picture becomes much more clear. Now, the first word that we have to say when we're entering this realm of the instrumental reality of Mesopotamia is lyre, 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 and harps. Harps and lyres are not exactly the same musicologically. There's a bit of a difference between them, but I will be using these two terms perhaps interchangeably through the video. I'm basically referring to this broad category of instruments like that. They were very much the central instrument of the Mesopotamian tradition. They were the dominant ones. It seems that the music theory was derived from their usage. Music theory was described through the lens of the strings on a lyre or a harp. And an even more interesting theory is the idea that the earliest lyres or harps were derived from the bow, as in the actual bow and arrow. And usually I'm not keen to emphatically support a hypothesis that can't really be proven, because you can't really prove that. I think we can never go back in time and really pinpoint the evolution, but this one specifically, I'm keen to support it, because any model that postulates the notion that humans invented something for killing first and then found another use for it, I'm like, yeah. Knowing human nature, that makes perfect sense. Because I was talking about it to somebody and they said, what if the lyre as the instrument came first and then the bow and arrow? And I was like, nah, no way. Come on, no. Bows and arrows are pretty old, and I think, you're living in the Neolithic in the Middle East, or the Paleolithic even in the Middle East. There's tigers, or I don't know what animals they had trying to kill you. Yeah, I'm just gonna go for bow and arrows came first, personally. I can't prove it, but if I were to guess, that would be my guess. And then you have drums, which is very interesting. In all the sources that I've read, percussions are mentioned very frequently. I believe that the oldest known word for an instrument is, I believe, balag. I'm not sure. I'm gonna put on screen what language it is. I think they used to think that it meant a harp or lyre, but it has been convincingly argued to mean a drum now. And one of the sources that I've read indicates that there's many different words for drums, something like 9 terms for drums in the cuneiform texts, but like only 7 for lyres and harps. So there really was a proliferation of different types of drums, some of them very big drums. Now, does this imply a very heavy percussive drive behind their music? Does that imply that their music was like modern Middle Eastern music, or Cuban music, or Greek music, Indian music, where you have these really florid accompaniments with the drums going maybe not. Maybe they just like to have many different drums, but they were used sparsely. I'm open to all interpretations personally. I haven't really thought about it much. Then you had different types of flutes, obviously, which is not a big surprise. Flutes are the human universal when it comes to instrumentation. I believe reed instruments were also found, so pipe-like instruments that had reeds in them that would produce something like the aulos, or maybe even the sorna that we have in the Middle East today. Again, I'm not certain of it. And then you had the lutes, which I want to give a special mention to. Now, lutes, it's very easy if you're from that part of the world today, West Eurasia, Europe, the Middle East, North Africa, etc., to take for granted that lutes, these kind of instruments, are just a given, that they must have always been around and must have always been very prevalent. Now, they were around back then, but for most of antiquity in that corner of the world, they seem to have been at most tertiary instruments, at best tertiary instruments. They're not mentioned that often, they're not visually represented that often. We haven't found that many of them in the archaeological records compared to the lyres. Really, the reality of antiquity, this is true for the ancient Greco-Roman world, this is true for the Mesopotamians, this is true for the ancient Iranians, this is even true for the Norse, the Scandinavians of the early Middle Ages. Really, it's all the attention on lyres, lyres, lyres. From 1000 BC, we see the emergence of large ensembles, straight up orchestras actually, which would have required a certain degree of, you know, sort of preparation and education, and you can really tell that by that point, we can be certain, and it must have had been for thousands of years at that point, but music was really a settled style and science and art form for them to be able to have all these big ensembles in the course and everything. So yeah, the first orchestras, first musical ensembles, they come down to us from Mesopotamia. Now let's talk about what the actual music sounded like, the actual melodies. Now, let's go a little bit over the evolving understanding that we had of Mesopotamian music. Before the 60s, the widely accepted model was that of the likes of Kurt Sachs, who proposed what is now a completely outdated view of music history. I mean, it is like one of the foundational elements of modern ethnomusicology is the rejection of this idea that was once very prevalent in ethnomusicology and music history, which was an idea of the continuous linear development of music, that as you go, the more you go back in time, the more music was primitive and complex and simplistic and not worth really bothering with, and the more you advance in time, the more complex it becomes. And a strong belief back then was that, oh, the first music must have been one note, and then two note, and then three note. And Kurt Sachs' view was that the Mesopotamian civilizations must have had a pentatonic system, that their music must have been five note, and that the Greeks inherited this ancient five note system and then invented heptatonicism, heptatonicism being the seven note system that we still have today in Western music or Middle Eastern music. And then in the 60s, we have found the Hurrian clay tablets from the city of Ugarit, which is in modern-day Syria. Not Mesopotamia proper, really, geographically, but it is widely accepted that they are a representation of the music of Mesopotamia. Some of the language in it is Mesopotamian. There's so many terms that are, connected to Mesopotamian terms, so we know it is representative of Mesopotamia, basically. Now, there are two things that the Hurrian hymns give us. The first one being a broad understanding of the actual music of Mesopotamia, and secondly, the Hurrian hymns themselves, which are a specific composition of this musical system. Now, there's a lot of confliction between the two, and there's a lot of misunderstanding between the two, so we're going to clarify some things. Firstly, what we do understand very well, that experts have managed to interpret, is the broad modal system of Mesopotamian music. And the research into those clay tablets has shown that Mesopotamian music was not only heptatonic, therefore seven notes, but more incredibly, it was diatonic. Now, what does diatonic mean to those of you who are not musicians? To put it very simply, except for the Phrygian mode, it's whatever sounds Western European. Like, the melodies of Mesopotamia would have sounded to our ears like any Irish or French or German folk song. This was pretty shocking at the time of the reveal, and there has been some pushback that have tried to go, no, it can't be the case, but it turns out that, yeah, it is the case. The music of Mesopotamia, the music that Gilgamesh and everything were vibing to, melodically speaking, in terms of the melody, that is the sequence of pitches one after the other, would have given to us a typically Western European sound, because the modes were diatonic. What is less clear, however, and has not been settled, is the nature of the melody of the Hurrian hymns. And unfortunately, there's a lot of variations on the internet that are just posted without the proper contextualization. And so a lot of people think, oh, we know about the Hurrian hymns. It's there. We've deciphered them. If you actually look into it, there are many, many, many different competing models of interpretation. The first one, I believe, was by a man named Woolstan or Woolstan. And then this interpretation was rejected and challenged by Madame Duchesne-Guillemin, who brought her own interpretation to the table. And then this interpretation was challenged by Anne Kilmer. Now, I want to talk a little bit about Anne Kilmer's contribution because she has been invaluable in our understanding of Mesopotamian music. Now, her interpretation of the Hurrian hymns is interesting, and it's pretty unique, and it has gotten quite a lot of attention, and it's often mentioned without the proper contextualization. Her interpretation of the Hurrian hymns is that they included harmony, that is, the simultaneous sounding of two different pitches at the same time. See, in these tablets, what we find is pairs of strings mentioned together. Pairs of strings mentioned together. I'm going to give you an example. The ancient texts show us pairs of strings. So, for example, let's say, it's not even tuned, but let's say that, so these two are mentioned together, and then these two, and perhaps these two. So there's different configurations of pairs of strings mentioned together. Kilmer's interpretation of that was that these were chords, dichords, chords made up of two notes, that in other words, wherever you write a melody with that first string, you always simultaneously sound the other string with it. So according to this initial interpretation by Anne Kilmer, the Hurrian hymns would be full-on polyphonic almost. They would be harmonic, kind of like what you find in medieval Europe. And I have a functional counter-argument to that, actually. I am relatively well versed in medieval Iranian music theory, and in medieval Iranian music theory, what you do find is also pairs of intervals mentioned together, pairs of strings, for example, mentioned together, usually in relationships of fourths. So the first and fourth interval, and second and fifth interval, and etc., right? And these are not chords. Like these are absolutely not chords. These are just a way to categorize certain intervals that are perceived as having some form of intrinsic relationship to one another acoustically due to the cultural tastes of medieval Iranians. But that's really all it is. So the notion that these are dichords is Kilmer looking at this, at these pairs and thinking, what if they're chords? But there's really no solid reason to think that it is the case. I'm going to link to you different interpretations of the Hurrian hymn and how differently different people interpret it, and you'll see how all these interpretations vary extremely. The only thing that is settled is that the music was diatonic, would have had this broadly Western European sound to our modern ears, but outside of that, we really don't know how to decipher the Hurrian hymns exactly. I don't believe there's any clear academic consensus as to this is the best version, or this is the best version. There's the more famous versions, but that was the first one that was posted on YouTube 10 years ago, and so that's why this one has 3 million views or whatever. But this has nothing to do with the academic acceptance of it. So the Hurrian hymns, people think that we understand them very clearly. The melodies themselves, we don't. What the Hurrian tablets, what the discoveries in Ugarit of the Hurrian clay tablets have given us is an understanding of the broad musical language of Mesopotamia in terms of the fact that it's diatonic. We understand the soundscape generally, and ultimately I don't think that us not knowing exactly what the Hurrian hymn sounded like really matters. This is a point that I make in this video, in which I explain how, going after reconstructing melodies is not that important because music is a language. If you want to learn language, you don't want to just learn preconceived sentences and learn to repeat them and parrot them. You haven't learned how to speak French if you do this. If you want to learn how to speak French, you want to learn the mechanics of the grammar, how the structure works, how the actual algorithm works, and then you generate that algorithm. And we at least have access to a part of that algorithm, which is that it was diatonic, that's how they tuned their instrument. And so we know how their melodies would have sounded anyway, just in the purest of technical terms, in terms of pitch. So at that point, the Hurrian hymns, they sound like this or like this. It's the same pitches, just in different permutations. I'm not saying it wouldn't be cool to know what it sounds like. All I'm saying is, even if we do discover the melodies of the Hurrian hymns, ultimately we'll have discovered the melodies of the Hurrian hymns. It's not going to fundamentally change our understanding of Mesopotamian music as a whole. We already have access to it due to the decipherment that their music was largely diatonic. Now, I want to talk a little bit in more cultural modern terms about the question of the orientality of Mesopotamian music or lack thereof. A common psychological reaction that you will encounter is people saying that's impossible. It could not have sounded Western European. How can you say that? Why? Anne Kilmer points that out in one of her articles where in one of the museums where they play reconstructions of Mesopotamian music, people are struck by how very similar it sounds to European melodies, and people say, well, that's impossible. And this is a case of associations for me. I think we all have this innate instinctual feeling that whatever it must have sounded like, it must have sounded like this. You know, the double harmonic major, it has the Middle Eastern sound to it, and of course that Middle Easternness is mostly a stereotype. We don't use it that much in the Middle East. We do use it, but not as much as Hollywood thinks we does, because that's the scale that Hollywood always automatically uses to represent the Middle East, even though, you know, it's just as much, if not more, utilized in Bulgaria and Greece and parts of Europe, literally, than in the Middle East. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The point is that I always make this point that the double harmonic major, this sound that instinctively says Middle East to us, these things do not work like phenotypes, right? So you look at how I look, you look at how my friend Shinji looks. Clearly you can tell that our ancestry is not in Scandinavia for the past 2,000 years, right? You look at Chris Hemsworth, well, clearly most of his ancestors from the previous 4 generations are not from Nigeria, right? Okay, phenotypes work this way, but music doesn't work that way. There's nothing about the weather of the Middle East. It's not like this kind of scale can only arise in deserts. It's a completely cultural association that we have today with the Middle East. And actually the earliest emergence of the double harmonic major, as far as we know, is in ancient Greek music. It's found in the first tetrachord of the Lydian chromatic mode, I believe, and the second tetrachord of the Hypolydian. I may be saying bullshit right now, I'm not sure if I'm being correct. But anyway, it is found in ancient Greek music, that much we know. And then you have the writers of the early Islamic Golden Age, the Arab writers, who consistently credit Greek sources, consistently, they repeatedly point to ancient Greek musical treatises like Aristoxenos, for example, as being the key pillar on which they are basing their nascent musical Arabic theory. Arabic music, as far as we know, sounds Eastern because it sounds Greek in a way, ancient Greek basically. And this is a big mindfuck for a lot of people. A lot of people think that's impossible. For a lot of people, if I were to give them the double harmonic major and then the standard major scale of the West, and I were to tell them one of these modes historically was adopted by Westerners from Easterners and vice versa, which one is which, 99% of people will say the double harmonic major must come from Mesopotamia. Of course, it sounds Mesopotamian because it sounds Eastern. Again, these are associations. Historically, the reality is actually the other way around. Now, there are dissenting voices to this. And I have to mention this because if you go on YouTube, searching for reconstructions of Mesopotamian music, you will unfortunately find many reconstructions that claim to be reconstructions. So we're not talking about, historically themed music like the Fichter brothers themes, whatever, it's historically themed, it's not supposed to be historical. But there will be people claiming to be making actual scientific reconstructions, and I'm using this term very liberally here, using Middle Eastern scales, using the Hijaz Makam, for example. I have to stress this. These reconstructions are entirely disregarded by the near totality of the modern musicological scene, except for the fringe groups that do basically hold these views. There's a fringe element in Mesopotamian music discourse that claims that the music of the Middle East, as it is today, has always existed ever since ancient Mesopotamia, that ancient Mesopotamia had the makam system or the dasgah system that we have today, those Middle Eastern scales and modes, a lot of them with microtonality or with these chromatic aspects, and it's just no. There is no evidence for this. And the people who claim to say that, oh, we know that it's the case, I have contacted them personally, asking them, could you please point me to the evidence, the exact evidence that made you confident to use the Hijaz Makam, this double harmonic major Middle Eastern scale, for your reconstruction of the Hurrian hymns? And basically I never got a clear answer. The answers were all highly conjectural and everything, and when I did some more research, I found that what they rely on is genetic memory. What they're saying is, the anecdote that they actually give us is that they were playing their reconstruction of the Hurrian hymns in the known historical diatonic modes, and then they were told by an audience of Syrian or Lebanese musicians, no, you should play it in this mode. And these people thought to themselves, well, it must be true because they are the genetic descendants, and so it must be some genetic memory speaking from inside. That's what they're relying on. Genetic memory. There's an ancient Greek term for that kind of methodology. What was the term for that? Aristoxenos!
Oh, this is the good shit.
Aristoxenos!
Nah, the fuck you want?
What was the, where it was the Mesopotamian thing?
Oh yeah, the genetic memory thing,
Right,
right?
the genetic memory thing. There's an ancient Greek term, a very technical term for that.
Yeah, we have a word for that in ancient Greek. It's, give me a second. Completely fucking unscientific.
Yes, thank you. Completely fucking unscientific. I don't want to be too harsh here, but no. This is not how it works. You cannot, okay, listen. I'm Middle Eastern. I get it, okay? Their argument is that the only reason they think that it was only heptatonic is because of the Eurocentrism and the racism and the Western bias of these musicians. Now listen, I'm the first to point out how historically ethnomusicology and music history has been extremely Eurocentric, and unfortunately Eurocentrism in musicology continues to exist. Not in ethnomusicology, however, anymore. I truly believe myself, from a Middle Eastern perspective, that modern ethnomusicology that is spearheaded largely by Western folk has actually completely outgrown its initial roots in racialist theory of 19th century, racism and everything. Because remember, anthropological sciences used to be literally just white supremacy not so long ago. They started out 200 years ago in the heyday of European colonial imperialism. I do not dispute any of that. However, the reason why it is consistently accepted today that Mesopotamian music was heptatonic and diatonic is not because of some Western bias, it's because that's what the evidence shows us. If you want to claim otherwise, you have to produce good, tangible evidence of a sort of makam system of Middle Eastern scales like Hijaz existing in Mesopotamia, and there is no such evidence to this date, none whatsoever. And genetic memory and all that kind of stuff does not have its place. I get it. I would like that to be true, because when I started out studying historical music, it was Middle Eastern music that I studied first, and I was convinced that it must be the Iranians, because I'm Iranian, and I thought, well, the Persian Empire and everything, it must have been the Iranians who came up with everything, the Hijaz mode. Middle Eastern music must have started in Iran as we know it. And yeah, not necessarily. Most of the things that are distinctly Middle Eastern sounding to our ears today are, for the most part, attributable to Greek developments. And that's just what the evidence shows. If evidence to the contrary does manifest, I will gladly make another video and talk about that, and that's fine. But there's a lot of people who love to say absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, and a lot of people say, well, we just haven't found the evidence yet, we just haven't found. And I fundamentally disagree with that attitude. This attitude of it's like when you're going to start a marathon, they're about to run and they're just ready and they're just waiting for when the evidence shows up. They're just ready. At any point the evidence is going to show up. Like, that's not how it works. You can't just tell yourself, I know it's true, it must be, and I'm just gonna wait. I'm sure the evidence will show up at some point, maybe even after I die, but I'm just gonna I know it's out there. You don't know that it's out there. I'm not saying it's impossible. Again, there will be dissenting voices in the comments who will say, so you're saying it's impossible? No, I'm not saying it's impossible. I'm saying there's no evidence for it, and until there's any evidence for it, we have to consider the current model as the most plausible, which is that everything from the Hijaz Makam to microtonality and everything seems to be a Greek development that rested on an earlier adoption of Mesopotamian heptatonic diatonicism. I have to swallow my Middle Eastern pride here. The music that I myself as a Middle Easterner practice, that is makam based, that is melodically based, that is ornamental and everything, that I find so much pride in being able to play and being able to compose, I cannot simply invoke it as some sort of legacy of the earliest days of Iranian and other Middle Eastern civilizations. That's just what the facts show. Mesopotamian music, for the most part, would have sounded relatively familiar to Western European ears, which I think is quite fascinating, actually. Ultimately, the question must be asked, is there any lasting legacy that Mesopotamia left, musically speaking? And I would say absolutely. The influence that the Mesopotamians had on Greece is huge. It used to be that people thought that Greece was the cradle of civilization, that they came up with everything on their own, and now really we know that they were a relatively young upstart civilization that based so much of what it had and the accomplishments of others. Everything that was once thought to be uniquely Greek, from their poetry to their music, even the philosophy nowadays, we have found antecedents that go back before to the East. And it shows in the music. We know that Pythagoras went to the East. We know that he brought back many influences from Egypt, from the East. And while it's very easy to think that any Eastern influence would have been the Hijaz Makam or anything that stereotypically sounds Middle Eastern to this day, now we come to the realization with the current data available that the Eastern influences were things that to us today now sound Western European. The Greeks adopted heptatonic diatonicism from the Mesopotamians. I think it is impossible to argue against that. As Richard Dumbrell said, the mathematics, the philosophy, everything, they got inspired by the East and somehow they forgot to bring back the music home. That doesn't make any sense. We can be pretty certain that it was a Mesopotamian influence upon the Greeks, and the Greeks adopted it. And the Greeks will go on to develop the chromatic and harmonic modes that live on to this day in Middle Eastern music. They are the basis of, again, the Hijaz makam or the microtonal makams like Bayat, etc., that we use to this day in the Middle East. But they die out at the beginning of the Middle Ages in Europe, and Europe goes back to square one, basically. It goes back to the heptatonic diatonic modes that still define the sound of Western European music to this day. And now, because of the globalism of Western Europe, because it has influenced China, it has influenced every corner of the globes, you find these heptatonic diatonic melodies in every corner of the globe due to Western influence. But if you think about it for a second, these all go back to some degree to Mesopotamian influence. Ultimately, those heptatonic diatonic melodies that are typically Western European sounding, they are the lasting legacy of ancient Mesopotamia that still endure in every corner of the globe to this day. I think that to be absolutely incredible. Now I'm going to finish the video with a quick little performance on the lyre in one of the modes, if you want to call it them, one of the pitch categorizations of the Mesopotamians, just to give us a broad idea of what their melodies may or may not have sounded like, given what we do know. I think I have this idea that every time a musical performance is done of a style of music that is not fully understood, it should always end with the musicians going, eh. I think that phase is very, very important. Those pitches would have been familiar to the Mesopotamians. The timbre of the instrument would have been familiar to the Mesopotamians, but other than that, we don't know much, unfortunately. Anyway, it's Farid Farajji, and I hope you enjoyed this video.